Welcome to Regen360. More than ever, we need to step it up to regenerate the health of the planet and all living things. We exist to help educate, inspire, and accelerate transformational action. Here's your host, David Gottfried.
Hey everyone, it's David Gottfried. So great to have you here. I really would love you to hear this interview with Joel Makower. Joel is the chairman and co-founder of the GreenBiz group. He's also founded the Verge Conference and GreenBiz annual conference. You may have heard of him. He's not only a renowned journalist, but he's really somewhat a father of the green business movement. He's been writing and reporting on this for 3 to 4 decades. He's been a facilitator, a moderator, a keynote speaker, and a thought leader. He puts out the GreenBiz weekly newsletter, which kind of stirs up the pot and wakes us up. What I love is Joel is always pushing, not only to make Earth better, but to help companies go green, to lessen their risk, and to inspire us to go deeper and to understand the implications and the benefits. He's an advocate for more justice and equity in business, in the movements, and trying to wake us up on that front as well. I've known Joel for 3 decades. I started reading his materials before we met, and he's always been at the forefront of thought leadership. And it's just such a treat to be able to interview him, ask him the questions on my mind, on your mind, and to hear his answers. At the end of the day, it's also inspiring, and he gives me hope. He gives us hope for a just transition, not only one of equity and lessening risk, but that we can survive. So please join me. So Joel, wonderful to have you here for our Regen360 iTunes show. You and I have been friends for decades, kind of soldiers in this green war together. Yeah. We'll figure out in this podcast who's winning, but just lovely to have you here.
Yeah, it's always great to see you, David.
And as prep for this interview, and we've done quite a few, I had fun, as always, going through your GreenBiz weekly blurb. I encourage everyone to get hold of that because Joel, almost like none other, speaks truth. He goes right at it and doesn't dodge the critical issues. And Joel's always been a journalist. One quote, which we'll start with, that stuck out, Joel wrote, "If money does indeed talk, it's screaming for help right now." And so that's what I want to focus on, the money and the screaming and what answers, directions we could give them, because it's now more than ever. And I think you attended COP26 because you wrote about your nature symposium you conducted, but and now out of COP26, they have to do COP27, maybe because they didn't get to it enough. That's David's thoughts, but there's a lot of discussion of the money people at COP26 with this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and then those 450 banks representing 130 trillion, they're kind of steeped in what we're calling ESG, and you write a lot about that, environment, social governance. But let's get to the money could talk, and why do you write that they're screaming for help right now?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for reading my newsletter. It's just to give it the plug from the top, it's a Monday morning newsletter that I write called GreenBiz, and comes out, it's free. Just go to greenbiz.com/newsletters and sign up. But yeah, I mean, I've been writing a lot about ESG and sustainable finance, and it's a fascinating world, both because of, on one hand, you've got all these institutional investors, some of the world's biggest money managers and asset owners that are leaning into environmental, social, and governance, ESG metrics, and starting to realign their portfolios in that direction. At the same time, is a lot of talk and not as much action as as it appears to be. And that specific line about if money could talk, it's screaming for help right now is really about coming out of out of Glasgow, but also the world of ESG in general. I think it's undergoing, like a lot of these things do, some growing pains where, it's a thing and people say, wow, it's cool, it's a thing, but nobody's going to do it, and then people start doing it. So like green billing, you could relate to this, all sorts of things from your career, David, and then all of a sudden they start doing it, and it's like cool, but it's never going to become the mainstream, and all of a sudden everybody's doing it, and it's all of a sudden, yeah, it's the mainstream, but it's really not as good as it could be, and because it's really a low bar. And then there's maybe even some backlash and some claims of greenwash, and then all of a sudden there's some higher order standards, or maybe there's a whole new organization, ILFI, or in the case of the built environment, that comes with a whole different piece of this. So I think we're going through that right now with ESG, except that there's trillions of dollars on the table right now, number one. And number two, we don't have a lot of time to, putz around with all these different steps. We need to get done right now. And so I think this world of ESG and sustainable finance is probably the most fascinating thing going on in sustainability right now, but it's kind of a mess. And so that's what I was writing about, and that's where that line came from.
Yeah, and that comes out, the mess, and I think you said it's the Wild West and that they need concrete plans. And a lot of times there's no penalty, there's big claims, but there's no backbone to this.
Well, it's not pure greenwash. So just to be clear, it's really that this stuff these are not just a huge ship that needs to realign in a big ocean, but it's a whole fleet of ships, hundreds, thousands of them that are all need to reorient themselves, and that does not happen quickly. And so banks, institutional investors, asset owners, asset managers have all made these commitments, and some of them are big and seemingly bold and audacious commitments, but they still have legacy investments. They still have profit margins to meet and stockholders to please and all of that. And some of that, you don't just pivot on a $1 trillion dime. You have to back out of things, you have to do it and back into things, and you have to make sure you're doing that in a way that you don't hurt your employees, you don't hurt your shareholders. And so that's the challenge right now. And then of course, you've got all these people pressuring you, Bill McKibben and his whole cohort, and lots of activists and governments that are saying, wait, we don't have time. We need to do this yesterday or 10 years ago. And so this isn't a change by 2050 or even by 2030. We need to change by 2022. And I think that's the challenge that they're all meeting and trying to figure out, how do we do this in a way that makes everybody happy, or at least the fewest number of people unhappy?
Well, it's so tough. I know you wrote that one confirming factor out of COP26 at Glasgow was everyone's talking more about 1.5 degrees C instead of the 2.0. But even though with the Paris Agreement, we're supposed to be at 50% by 2030 and then net zero by 2050, we need that 50% by next year. And so how do we accelerate? How do we, and I know these $1 trillion of investments, some of that's going to fossil fuels still. They have the shareholders with the quarterly reports. If you miss your numbers, your stock tanks. At the same time, we need that 50% now.
Right.
So how do we guide them? And even and I don't believe it's all greenwash. I think some of these major corporations are really working hard at it. I have friends at Blackstone and Wells Fargo and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Google and Apple and Adobe. I know they're working hard. Wells Fargo is looking at scope 3 emissions and embodied carbon, and good work. But how do we separate the good guys from the not so good guys? And how do you define results versus effort?
Yeah. Well, there's lots to talk about in that question you just asked. I mean, first of all, I don't separate into good guys and bad guys. I mean, if you think of a standard bell curve, right? At one end, there's a lot of good guys, the good guys we know, and that range from the values-driven companies, the Patagonias and the Ben and Jerry's, and as well as interface and depending on how you think about it, for some a Walmart or some others who are really showing the way.
Right.
At the other end, you've got some number of cheaters and laggards, mostly in the fossil fuel world and mining and extractives, and they're just they're dragging their heels and all that. But even a lot of them are already starting to do some stuff, whereas a few years ago they weren't. But in that big fat middle is everybody else. And that's probably 90% of companies in the world. And they're committing what I call random acts of greenness. And it's not just small little inconsequential things. Sometimes they're big, bold, audacious things. There's product things and process things and facility things and employee things, and maybe community and philanthropy things, and maybe they're thought leader things. And
equity and justice and circularity.
Yeah, they're talking about equity and justice, just transition, and all these things, and they're filing the reports and the ESG and this, and they're getting good ratings, but they're still kind of disconnected dots. And so, at the leadership end, you've got companies that are thinking more about, well, how do we operate in a world where energy, carbon, water, materials, toxicity become constraints, and what are the opportunities that fall out of that? And those are the really, really interesting conversations. That's where you live, David, and Regen and everything else that you've done, is the opportunity side of this.
Right.
And so the question isn't, so how do you think about, a legacy polluting company that's now reorienting themselves, and they're only maybe 20 or 30 or 50% of the way there? Are they a good guy or are they a bad guy? I don't know. Our friend John Elkington wrote a book back in the 90s called Cannibals with Forks, and the title comes from this question: if a cannibal eats with a fork, is that progress? Right? And so
maybe he has a napkin and is sitting upright at the table.
Yeah, right. Pinky out. Yeah, I know. if McDonald's starts using some percentage of sustainable beef and cage-free eggs, and runs their some of their, or many of their stores on renewable energy, and maybe make them out of sort of green buildings, using green building standards, is that progress? Or it's just McDonald's and they're always going to be a problem? I mean, and we could spend this entire conversation and then some to talk about that one company and that one question, and some people do. I sort of sit in the middle of that, which is it's the line that I wish environmental activist organizations would say more. It's 5 words: thank you, now do more.
Love it.
They're really they're
that's 5.
They're pretty good with 3 words: not good enough. In other words, some company announces something that is
or 2 words.
Yeah, no way, or something slightly risky, slightly saltier than that. But so I think that they need to get credit for what they're doing, and they need to be pushed and prodded and pulled to do more faster. And so that's not a very satisfying place to be in a world where everybody wants to know, to your question, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? Because I don't know that there's any good guys, and I don't know that there may be a few bad guys, or maybe a few good guys too, but pretty much everybody else is in that big fat middle. And that's where they need our help. The good guys don't need a lot of help. The bad guys probably aren't going to, no matter how much help we gave them, are going to move much. And so it's that big fat middle, which is where my career exists, and I suppose yours as well, which are the companies that either want to or have to or whether they do it voluntarily or involuntarily, need to move down this path. And they start slowly, and they start with a few things, and then talk them up big time. And then they realize that ain't going to cut it. And then they realize they need to do more and more and more and more. The problem is that we're now at a point where that pace of change won't cut it. That pace of change is simply not sustainable, in that we need to be moving much further, faster. The scale, scope, and speed of change is simply not good enough. And so, the challenge and the really interesting tension and point of creative tension where I live is how do you celebrate progress without celebrating incrementalism? How do you move along the folks who need it without shaming them? And how do we do that as fast as possible? And then leverage the whole ecosystem, because it's not just the companies. They exist in a world where they have customers and shareholders, investors, shareholders, and suppliers, and they all have to be part of this as well. And so it's not just up to even the most enlightened board of directors or CEO of a major company to say, we're going to change. It starts there, often, not always, but usually starts there. But they have to enlist this whole other ecosystem. And that's where this gets really, really messy. And so I revel in that mess, because I think it's pretty interesting, and I just find it fascinating. And the insertion points that I personally and professionally can deploy to help move things along and increase the pace of change. But it is still, at the end of the day, messy.
Well, and you've hit on so many great things. Even though I said, who are the good guys or bad guys, I 100% agree with your answer. In fact, I remember early days at US Green Building Council, some people only wanted to let in the good guys.
Right.
But you would never green earth if you didn't embrace the Superfund site people. And they didn't want to have those people at our table.
Yeah.
But the real truth was they had to be at the table because we needed to show them an alternative path. And what you said, even if they did a little green and then a little more and a little more, they had to start. So if you boycott them, you just create a war.
you isolate them and you don't engage. We have this challenge at our company. We're 45 people now, growing, and we put on these events and these newsletters and news, everything else we do. And we struggle with some of this because we have companies that, and I won't name them right now because it's really not, the problem statement is what's interesting is how do you let them in the tent? Do they want to speak? They want to sponsor, they want to pay us money to not to green, just to be at the table. And do we let them? I'll name one company that we had a struggle with, because Koch Industries wanted to come and they wanted to exhibit at our flagship event, GreenBiz, that we have every February in Scottsdale, which is the coming together of about 1,000, 1,200 corporate sustainability executives. And they wanted to be at the table, and they have this, their name notwithstanding, Koch Brothers and Koch Industries, KOCH. They have companies that make glass for solar panels. I think they have a company that makes some components for wind turbines. They're sort of in this to a certain extent. They also have, renewable energy, fossil fuel, and I think they have some renewables now. And, of course, the Koch brothers are this reputationally horrible in the progressive community and the environmental community players that basically have funded the conservative movement for the past, couple decades. And so how do you think about that? Do they want to be at the table? They're trying to do things. They weren't there to say, we're green, we're good. They just wanted to learn, and they wanted to exhibit the things that they are doing.
Sure.
And we had a whole town meeting in our staff about that. And we ended up telling them, you know what, well, keep your money, come to the event. But probably not, at least for a while, it's not good to do this. And maybe we'll see in the future. I'll tell you one other quick story. At the same event a few years ago, at the closing reception, two women walked up to me. I did not know them, and they introduced themselves, and they said, hello, we're with ExxonMobil Chemical, and wanted to introduce ourselves and tell you two things. One, this was a fabulous conference. We learned so much and met so many great people. And two, we really appreciate how we were accepted in the community. And I ended up sending a note to the team, congratulatory about this great event we had just done. This was maybe 4 years ago. And I said, by the way, I want to tell you about these two women who walked up to me and said this: whatever you think about ExxonMobil, we should all be proud that we created the conditions for this company to come and learn and be part of the conversation. They weren't exhibiting, they didn't doing anything other than just being there. And for me, that's what's really important. And yeah, we do get into these messy conversations, just to use that word again. But it's really, I think, a healthy thing to be discussing and debating and figuring out what is, we're a big tent. And so how big of a tent do we really want to be? Do we want to have tobacco companies talking about sustainability, or gun companies, or ExxonMobil, or anyone else? How do we think about that? And we vet it on a company by company basis. But that's how we need to be thinking about this, is instead of trying to broad brush everything, which is kind of what I see out there in the environmental community and the media as well.
Well, and what we're about, and you've always been about it in your name, GreenBiz, it's about greening of business. It's about change and transformation. But if the trillion-dollar or multi-billion-dollar companies aren't GreenBiz yet, it starts with education. And you're a convener, and GreenBiz 22, your next one in Arizona, which I encourage everyone to go to, February 15th through 17th, is about convening. And if you're going to convene, accelerate, transform, you want to transform all, including the clunker companies, the clunker buildings, the clunker cars. You want to show them another way.
Yeah.
But just one more thing, with the GreenBiz, you want to show them how to create more green, the money of green through environmental.
Yeah. I mean, it's not always about more money, but what it is increasingly about is less risk, or more calculated risk. You probably used to do this, and I did, and you've been to 1,000 presentations where someone else did. They talk about the business case for sustainability, as if there's a business case for living on a dead planet. And it's always, increase revenue, decrease costs, attract and retain talent, be a preferred supplier,
higher value,
innovation, higher reputation, or things like that. That's not untrue, but you can really shortcut that with one word: risk. Financial risk, technology risk, transition risks, stranded asset risk, right to operate risk, social license to operate, and of course, reputational risk. And that's where a lot of this companies now see this stuff, and particularly because their biggest investors are now saying, you need to look at this, and we're going to be, aligning our capital with companies that are in line with the Paris Agreement, or that we're going to make asset allocations decisions favoring companies that have lowered their risk in a climate constrained world. And so that's, I think, where we talk about this as much as anything. And of course, to deal with that risk, you need to deal with supply chain and employee engagement and renewable energy, build, buy, rent, lease, now, wait, all these kinds of questions. But they all roll up to this question of risk.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, you could go at it different ways. I always look at it as health first. Health of the planet, health of the people.
Sure.
But then you take risk, and when we hurt health or jeopardize health, there's risk. And maybe that's the juncture. But then the profit and loss statement, or even the price earning ratio of a company, looks at not only risk, but also income and expense and balance sheet. And I think beyond risk, and I don't want to mitigate it because I'd like to go deeper with you, the real essence of capitalism is creating value and wealth, and embedded in that is growth. but the growth this planet needs is in health and probably less risk. And at that nexus is going to be the corporations of the future who are the new Teslas. And we're finally waking up, maybe through these ESG funds, the bond funds, the analysts, the SASBs who now add environmental risk and materiality into the review of the companies. And so I see it all maybe merging, but we need to accelerate.
Sure. And it's important to note, David, that the way we civilians typically define risk is not how companies do. I mean, risk is they have whole risk departments, and their job is not to minimize risk. Their job is to manage it, because everything is a risk. Me opening my mouth and saying anything is a risk. Stepping out on the street is a risk. Making any business decision is I mean, sometimes they're low risk, but there can be risk if you're investing in something new or hiring somebody. Everything is a risk. And the question is, how do you manage that? How do you backstop it, or, not, because a no risk company is not going to grow. They're not going to change. They're going to probably, get swallowed up eventually. So I think that's the interesting part, is how do you, making a decision on to go 100% renewably powered as a company in your facilities, forget the supply chain. First of all, when, how fast, where does it make sense? What are the risks of locking in something now for a 20-year power purchase agreement that's going to, we wish we hadn't for some reason? That's a risk. So these are all things that you factor in, and then you don't go in with the lowest risk, but you go in with the best managed risk. You hedge risks all the time. You do all kinds of things to manage risk. And I think that's the important part, is it's that not that companies don't want to take risky moves. They do it all the time. Every new product introduction, every new office or facility launch, or whatever it is. And so that's how we think about risk. Sustainability people and risk people don't define risk in the same way. That's one of the things we try to help work out within companies, getting the risk people and the sustainability people to talk to each other and actually understand what the other is thinking about.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Now my mind, beyond trying to listen carefully, excuse me, what's that? I think about different levels of risk, and certainly risk management, but there's planetary risk. Is there a great risk to Earth itself? I actually think it will sustain and go on. So then there's human risk. Will we continue to be here? Is it a privilege that we're burning? Then there's corporate risk and capital and asset value and stock and market cap. And so how do we align these, the planet risk, the human risk, with corporate risk to find the sweet spot?
Yeah, that's an $80 trillion question. That's roughly the annual GDP around the globe. It's, I don't even know how to tackle that one, David. That's how do we align all those risks? I think it's not for companies, at least, to help people align their risk portfolio, because everybody has their own tolerance, their own issues, and everybody's in a somewhat different place. And all they can really manage is what surrounds them, their own value chain, their investors to their suppliers, their customers, and the regulators, and all of that. And so I don't know that all those things end up in a nice, neat alignment. I think, people, politics, money flows, personal, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, all those things factor in.
Darwin.
Yeah. Everybody's going to have a different set of dials that they're going to dial up and down, and making some of those kinds of calculations, whether it's consciously or not.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. I mean, today, Elon Musk was Time Man of the Year.
Was that right?
That's interesting. Did he deserve it or not? But Tesla, is a monstrous company. He risked a ton. He ignited the auto industry like no one since maybe Henry Ford. and this is much bigger. Certainly we've populated more. Very interesting is that the way, but what he's done is he's become the world's richest man. I don't know if it is today or yesterday. Tesla stock was down from over 1,000 today to, I don't know, 980. But he has shown certainly Ford, GM, in fact, their stocks are up because they're investing in EVs now, but his market cap is bigger than all of them almost combined.
Yeah. Well, we're going through this tumultuous time in a lot of industries where they were seeing major disruption. I mean, the auto industry is being hugely disrupted, and Elon Musk and Tesla were one of the big disruptors. Not the only one. They didn't invent the electric car. Electric cars have been around for a long time, as you well know, but they made it cool. They made them mass. They made them irresistible. And so that's a big deal. And so, but the industry was already on its way, you know, with the peaking of oil and fossil fuels and the climate considerations. I mean, we have to get rid of the internal combustion engine. That's not a question. What's going to replace it and who's going to win? Well, Elon's turns out is one of them. And we need Elon Musk's in every industry, not necessarily that personality, but the drive, the innovation, the willingness to jump off of a cliff and bring a lot of people with them in the spirit towards the quest of creating something that the world truly needs. And there were a lot of people who won't make that, who will make the jump and not survive, and a lot of other folks who will. And the question is really, why aren't there more Elon Musks? You know, why aren't there more, and who are they? I mean, there are some, and I'm sure all your listeners will have their own favorite person from somewhere in the world that's creating some green innovation, or that, and there are plenty of them, but not at his caliber, not at his degree of success. There have been several in China. And there's a few more in the U.S. But right now, you may have to take off your shoes to count the number of billionaires in the green and clean or clean economy or climate tech or whatever you want to call it space. But we need orders of magnitude more, and that's really, I think, you know, what was it beyond around Elon? Was it, how much of it was his investment? How much of it was his personality? You could say the same thing with Steve Jobs. He did not invent the personal computer, although the Apple II was one of the first, and it, you know, before the IBM PC, but he certainly made it cool. He had this incredible charisma. Not everybody loved him, but he had this genius. And yeah. So we need to just clone them left and right.
No, you're right on, and not just cars. Certainly, you know, green buildings, we've been at it. We need more billionaires there. We need the sequestration of carbon billionaires. I'm working with some firms that are looking at the concrete we make and getting the CO2 embedded in it, so it's a negative CO2 product.
Yeah.
And everywhere, we need it in water.
Yeah. Why
is black water still difficult in a home? There's just no reason for that. Or they debate gray water. There should be many more billionaires in that. There's a million areas we need it.
You know, there's a great quote that I've come to appreciate from Stephen Covey. Remember the 7 Habits of highly effective people? He said, "Change happens at the speed of trust." And think about it, where we are in the world right now, whether it's in the United States or frankly, the world, we don't trust one another anymore. We don't trust government. We don't trust business. We don't trust religious, institutions as much as we did. We don't trust the media. We don't trust each other. We're, certainly speaking here in the United States, we're hyperpartisan, and, it's not just, oh, you're different than me. It's, because you're against abortion and I'm support it. It's like you're the friggin' enemy now. It's not, we're not having healthy conversations. So in a world where we don't trust one another, how do we change? And if you look at, again, looking here in the United States, we're not changing. Congress is gridlocked. Most of the issues, immigration, gun control, build back better,
Even the
they're gridlocked, and it really boils down to how much do we trust our institutions, how much do we trust one another to make good judgments and do the right thing, or do we feel we need to impose our own judgment on you because you're wrong, period.
But even the vaccine, we don't trust science.
Yeah,
we don't trust that those people who died really die. I mean,
science should be at the top of the list of things that we don't trust. I mean, some people at least.
Crazy.
And, you know, if you look at climate and vaccines, two great cases in point.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I spent a lot of time looking at the brain and trying to understand the hot amygdala, which was invented, you know, to survive.
Right.
But that survival wiring we had isn't relevant in this world anymore because, you know, the tiger isn't generally chasing us and we can go to Whole Foods and buy food.
By tiger, probably.
But the trust is just still wired in prehistoric formation of our brains. And if you don't even trust science, there are 1,000 Nobel laureates, and that's a hard one.
And then to think of that in terms of, I know something else you wanted to talk about, it's a whole idea of a just transition. That we need to be looking at, of how do we make sure as we transition from this carbon intensive world to a low or no carbon world over the next, whatever it is, 1, 2, 3 decades, that we bring everybody along, not just the people who are already part of the consumer economy, but we create new opportunities for those who haven't had them. You know, the billions of people who still don't have fresh water or toilets, or who don't have electricity, reliable, at least electricity, and the people who live near power plants and toxic waste dumps and just normal waste dumps and ports. And, you know, I live in, you know, a pretty healthy neighborhood here in Oakland, but about 2 or so miles by the crow flies is the Port of Oakland and West Oakland, which has some of the highest rates of asthma in the world, probably. And that's, you know, and I'm apparently upwind from that or far enough away that I don't get those fumes. And we need to make sure that people in West Oakland, not to mention, you know, Bangladesh and Sudan and so many other impoverished parts of the world, have the opportunities, or at least some opportunities that we do. I mean, ideally as much as possible, but at least have, you know, food, water, housing, healthcare, education, some of the, you know, the sustainable development goals,
and opportunity.
And so, you know, here we are in this world where we're talking about a just transition, and we can also look at the just transition just as coal miners and oil men and women who you know we're going to need new jobs in the near future, need to be retrained. We can look at that as well, locally or globally, but it's still like, well, I want to take care of myself, and why should I worry about them and let them worry about themselves? I, you know, took myself from, you know, the bootstraps, lifted myself up, and here I am. I don't want to have to take care of other people, particularly people in other countries that I'm never going to go to. And so this is a problem too, of how do we not just take care of the planet, but how do we take care of one another? That's an even harder lift than trying to address climate change, but they go hand in hand.
Yeah, and getting the people who have to care about the have-nots, and even remembering that a lot of these haves, their grandparents or great-grandparents didn't have either. And,
right.
Or like, you know, mine running from the Holocaust and, you know, stowing away on ships so we could just survive. And,
right.
And then, you know, 3 generations later, they're cushy and spoiled, and, you know, they don't turn off the lights no matter what, and much less worry about the idling of the trucks at the piers that hurt the air at, you know, and near the port. We have to wake up there, all of us, you know, and myself included. I could do a much better job, and I need to learn. I need to learn about Jedi, you know, justice and equity, diversity and inclusion. And
well, one of the things we've learned, some of us have, I certainly have, is that we all need to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. because we live in our world, and we tend to know people who look like us or think like us, or our age, or whatever it is, our socioeconomic situation, and it's because it's comfortable. And companies traditionally have hired people who look like them and think like them and come from those backgrounds. And now we're at a place where we realize that's helped us get to some bad places, and we can do better, and we should do better. And that, by the way, when we do better, there's benefits to everybody, including ourselves. But it's uncomfortable. It requires being uncomfortable and having conversations that you might not want to have, or confrontations that you might not want to have, not necessarily bad or angry confrontations, but just different. And that certainly goes to that. You talk about that domestically or internationally or whatever level you want, sometimes even just the neighbors across the street. But I think that's one of the things we all need to learn.
No, it's fair. It's the elephant in the room. And it's the emperor no clothes, and no one wants to say, dude, you're naked.
Yeah. And that elephant with no clothes is really not a happy thing. So.
Well, one last question. So you've been at this 3 to 4 decades, maybe closer to 4. I heard about GreenBiz at least 3 decades ago, and you were, in fact, I think it was 91 when I started to work in green building. You were writing a newsletter or something on eco purchasing, and I remember reading that in 91. There was nothing. But why? Here you are still pushing more than ever with the GreenBiz, with circularity, with green finance. You've got like these 5 conferences next year, and you're on top of everything. And you don't have to be. Why? What's driven Joel all these decades? And you're still here at the top of your game, pushing. And now you're willing to entertain, even things that are uncomfortable. You always have as a journalist, but you're looking in the mirror every day. What is it that pushes?
It feeds me, David. This is what I was born to do. I'll give you the short version of how I got here, because I think it's telling that I studied journalism because I loved to learn and hated school. And so my hypothesis at the time, this is age 21 or so, it was that by sticking my nose into other people's business to write about it, I'd find something that I was good at and interested in and synced with my values and lifestyle and whatever else that I was thinking about at age 21. And so I didn't necessarily want to be a journalist, but I just thought it would be a good way to learn. And it did. And for the first 15 years, it turns out that what I was good at and interested in and synced with all those things was sticking my nose into other people's business to write about it. And, and along the way, retrospectively, 2 or 3 decades into this, I looked back and realized that the thread, the connection, the through line, I guess, of everything I was doing at the time was the intersection of business, technology, and society. So I wrote a book in 1981 about the health effects of office environments, because at the time they were sealing up buildings and tearing out the interiors and sealing the windows and running everything from a computer in the basement. And then they introduced computers, which hadn't been there, and they're bringing in synthetic materials and running HVAC less. And it turns out that the cushy office job was becoming kind of a toxic and unhealthy place. This was back in the same time that they were starting to organize office workers, the Service Employees Union, and Lily Tomlin, Jane Fonda, and Dolly Parton did that movie 9 to 5. This was part of a thing. And so that was, it turns out that stuff was later about green buildings and energy efficiency and ergonomics and things that became their own movements. But that through line, so I had an opportunity in 1989 to create the US edition of a British bestseller by the aforementioned John Elkington called The Green Consumer Guide. In the UK. We call it The Green Consumer. It came out in 1990, and it was during the big Earth Day of that year, and I was ordained as an instant expert on green consumer issues, and all of a sudden I had a weekly syndicated newspaper column, and in 90 newspapers writing, preaching the gospel that every time you open your wallet, you cast a vote for or against the environment, and the marketplace isn't a democracy. It doesn't take 51% of people voting to make a difference. This is before I realized that it didn't take 51% of people voting in a democracy either. Another story for another day. And then I realized two things. One, there was no green consumer movement in the US. I looked over my shoulder and realized I was kind of standing there by myself. And I later quipped that there may have been a reason that my book was called The Green Consumer.
No, I was reading your newsletter in 91.
But in 1991, I realized the other thing I realized was that the companies who I was being asked to come in and talk to about the so-called green consumer movement were dealing with a lot of their own issues. So in 1991, I launched the Green Business Letter, a monthly subscription newsletter. Books and other things came along. The web came along. I'm old enough to say that sentence. And then somewhere in the mid 90s, and I was now writing articles and giving speeches and sort of in the middle of all this stuff. Somewhere in the mid 90s, I remember sitting at my desk and having the thought, wow, I found it. I'm home. This is what I was looking for way back when I became a journalism major at University of California at Berkeley. This was what I was meant to do. This is the topic. And haven't looked back. But what I really did, just to finish out, what I love about this, then GreenBiz, the web, and GreenBiz came along in the events and everything built from there. This topic is never boring. It's, this as well as anybody, that's morphed along from, first do no harm to doing the right thing, to creating value, to being restorative and regenerative and net positive, to saving the earth, really. But this has become, there's new topics every year, topics that who'd have thunk topics every year that I can't believe. There's some that I can't believe we're still talking about this. And there's some like, I can't believe we're actually talking about this. And so it's fascinating to me. And yeah, I learn constantly. I love the people in the field. And so it's just a great place to be. I wake up some days and I've got this great company that I don't run. I have a great team that runs it. I'm not operational anymore. I'm just more of the going out and looking around at what's next. And I have days when I think of how lucky am I that I get to do this work in this life. I really can't imagine doing anything else. And I'm 2 months from this time that we're talking. I'm 2 months away from turning 70. That's a hard sentence to say. But I'm not even the slightest bit tired or bored or ready to do anything but this, because it as I go back to my first two words, it feeds me, or three words. It feeds me, and that's why I'm here.
We can't thank you enough for your burning passion for everything, not just journalism, but now, and not just green business, but Earth and helping people and creating a just transition. Thank you so much, Joel. This was a real treat for me.
It's a sincere pleasure. Thank you, David.
You've been listening to Regen360 with your host, David Gottfried.